Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The air in Maitama was thick with heat, the kind that wraps itself around your skin like a stubborn debt you cannot shake off. Evelyn Moore sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the unopened envelope on the worn-out stool beside her. The fan in the corner of the room made a soft clinking sound as it rotated, stirring hot air that barely relieved the heaviness in her chest. She'd come home from work later than usual. Her fingers still smelled faintly of paper and glue from patching old books at the community library in Garki. Her salary had just hit her account that morning, a sum so modest she almost laughed. A bag of rice, some Gary, a tin of Milo, that was what it could cover. She had already made peace with not living large. Evelyn had learned to walk barefoot through life's broken glass, careful not to bleed in front of people who once swore they loved her. Her world had gotten quieter since the breakup with Jordan Wade, her former fiancé who had exchanged their years of struggle for a new life of prestige and shiny suits. She had thought they were building something real, until the foundation cracked without warning. He left her behind like forgotten luggage at a crowded bus park. She never got a proper goodbye. Just silence and wedding photos with a woman she'd never met. And now, sitting in her one-room apartment, facing this strange envelope as though it might explode, she couldn't help but feel the irony hanging in the air like smoke. It was addressed to her in careful cursive. Miss Evelyn Moore, Maitama, Abuja. There was no return address. The paper felt expensive, like something printed for royalty. She hesitated, then picked it up with trembling fingers. She peeled open the envelope, expecting perhaps a charity drive or a fake promo. Instead, her eyes widened slowly, and she found herself reading the words over and over, as if comprehension would reveal a hidden prank. The Solomon Adegbite Foundation cordially invites you to the annual evening gala at the Eco-Continental Towers, Victoria Island, Lagos. The most exclusive event of the year. Only a select few receive such invitations. Politicians, entrepreneurs, oil magnates, and socialites who smelled like foreign cologne and spoke in clipped, foreign-accented English. What business did a quiet librarian from Garki have with the elite of Lagos? She hadn't applied for anything. She hadn't entered any raffle. Nobody owed her a favor. Her heart skipped. Her breath grew shallow. Was this a mistake? Should she call someone? But the invitation was specific. Her name, her exact address. There was a gold seal on the card, and a contact line for RSVP. She stared at the paper, her mind swimming. In all her years, nothing this elegant had ever arrived at her doorstep. It was like finding a pearl in a bowl of beans, utterly out of place. She stood up slowly, walked toward the only mirror in the room, and stared at herself. She looked tired. Her hair, though neatly packed, had lost the shine it once carried in her university days. Her eyes bore the weight of someone who'd seen both love and its betrayal. But beneath that surface was still a woman who had never bowed completely to hardship. She'd bent, yes, but never broken. Her heart began to pace with uncertainty. 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind. Should she go? What would she wear? What if it was a trap? Then again, life had already hurt her in ways no man could top. If fate was offering her a seat at a table she hadn't set, maybe it was time to find out why. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay on her mat, staring at the ceiling, watching as the shadows danced with the dim light of her rechargeable lamp. Her thoughts were louder than the neighborhood generator humming in the distance. Memories of Jordan crept in, uninvited as always. She remembered their early days in Enugu, fresh out of university, trying to start a life together. They had dreams then, big ones. She remembered the nights they sat outside on cracked pavement, talking about opening a bookstore or moving to Ibadan to start a community reading program. He used to look at her like she was all he needed to survive. But ambition, like smoke, finds cracks to escape through. When Jordan got his banking job and moved to Lagos, everything changed. Calls became fewer. Promises became vague. And then silence took the wheel. She saw the engagement pictures on Facebook one morning, and the name tagged beside his wasn't hers. The world didn't stop spinning, but hers tilted enough to make her stumble. She had packed all reminders of him into an old shoebox and shoved it behind her bookshelf. She never opened it again. Not even once. Now this gala, this strange, glimmering invitation, felt like an echo from a different life. A whisper from a version of her she thought had died when he walked away. And yet, it called to her. Not because she needed attention or revenge, but because something inside her, long buried under years of survival, wanted to stand tall again. Not for Jordan. Not for anyone. For herself. The next morning, Evelyn took the day off work and went to the Woods Market in search of a dress. She walked past rows of clothes hung like tired dreams on metal racks, her eyes scanning for something that whispered elegance but didn't scream for attention. A woman named Mama Zainab offered to help her find what she called class without noise. Together they dug through piles until they found it, a wine-colored gown with long sleeves and a graceful neckline. It was second-hand, but the fabric had a weight to it, like it had been worn by someone who mattered. The price wasn't cheap, but Evelyn paid for it anyway. She bought a pair of black heels that pinched her toes slightly, a small clutch bag that smelled faintly of perfume, and a silver necklace from a roadside vendor that caught the light just enough to be noticed. When she returned home, she hung the gown carefully on her wall and stared at it as though it were a mirror reflecting a life she was about to borrow. But deep down, she knew something had begun to shift. Her feet were still on the dusty floors of Maitama, but her spirit was already walking toward Victoria Island. She didn't know what the night would hold, but she was going to show up with her head held high. The world may not have clapped when she broke, but it was about to watch her rise, slowly, steadily, and without asking anyone's permission. The sun was already descending toward the horizon when Evelyn's flight touched down in Lagos. The evening sky above Murtala Muhammad Airport was the color of burnt orange, casting long shadows on the tarmac as she stepped off the plane. It had been years since she last visited the city. Everything felt louder than she remembered, faster, more aggressive, the air sticky with ambition and exhaust fumes. A driver had been arranged by the event organizers, a man named Daimeji, who waited just outside the arrival's gate, holding a placard with her name printed in bold. She almost walked past him, out of habit. She wasn't used to being expected. In the car, Daimeji barely said a word, but his eyes kept darting toward the rearview mirror, studying her quietly. Evelyn caught his gaze once and offered a soft smile. He nodded respectfully and focused on the road. The ride to Victoria Island took over an hour. Traffic in Lagos was a beast with no leash, snarling through every intersection. Evelyn sat still, her thoughts wrapped tightly around her nerves. The city buzzed past her window, hawkers weaving through lines of cars, billboards flashing images of perfect lives, and pedestrians moving as though their feet were powered by pure urgency. She held her clutch bag tightly in her lap, its small weight anchoring her as the car merged into the thundering chaos of the third mainland bridge. She had always believed that Lagos belonged to those who were loud enough to demand space or bold enough to take it by force. She was neither. But tonight, she was not here to compete with the noise. She was here to walk her path quietly and let it speak for her. When the car finally pulled up in front of the Eco-Continental Towers, her breath caught. The building stood tall, glowing like a monument to wealth and power, the golden lights reflecting off its glass like flames trapped behind crystal. At the entrance, two women in black gowns welcomed guests with practiced smiles. The marble floors inside were spotless, polished to a mirror sheen. Soft music filtered through hidden speakers, mingling with the scent of imported orchids and foreign cologne. Evelyn was led through the grand foyer, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she tried not to let the opulence swallow her whole. Everywhere she turned, she saw elegance in motion, women with necks like swans, men with voices like oil. Her wine-colored gown hugged her modestly, neither revealing nor hiding too much. Heads turned, but not many. She wasn't adorned with glitter or diamonds. She didn't shine, but she glowed with something quieter, something earned. At the reception desk, her name was checked off a gold-trimmed guest list, and a staff member escorted her toward the banquet hall. As the doors opened, Evelyn's eyes widened at the sight before her. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling, their light dancing over the heads of Lagos' most powerful. Waiters in white gloves moved with surgical grace between clusters of people, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and sparkling drinks. She found a seat near the far wall, a quiet corner where she could gather her thoughts without drowning in noise. She sat alone, folding her hands in her lap, pretending to study the program booklet. Conversations bloomed around her: real estate, politics, international schooling, destination weddings. None of them included her. She was a ghost at the feast, present but unseen. Still, she was not bitter. She'd come to observe, not to be seen. What she didn't expect was the sudden tightening in her chest when a familiar voice rang out across the room, laughing with that deep, confident tone she had once loved. Jordan Wade arrived like someone who knew his place at the top of the food chain. Tall, impeccably dressed in a navy tuxedo that looked custom-fitted down to the last stitch, he walked with the easy arrogance of a man who had never tasted real defeat. On his arm was a woman who glittered more than the chandeliers overhead. Tasha, his new lover, or perhaps now his wife, wore a gown that screamed money. Gold sequins clung to her body like armor, and her perfume announced her presence before her heels did. Evelyn felt her stomach turn, not from jealousy, but from the cruel irony of life's choreography. Of all the places, all the nights, fate had chosen this one to drop Jordan at her feet like a mocking offering. He hadn't seen her yet. He was too busy shaking hands, offering fake laughs, and sipping from a glass of wine he likely didn't pay for. Tasha leaned into him, whispering something that made him chuckle. It was the same smirk he once gave Evelyn when he told her about dreams of driving a Mercedes through the streets of Dubai. Her breath stilled when his eyes swept across the hall and landed on her. For a moment nothing happened. Then his expression shifted, recognition, surprise, amusement. He whispered into Tasha's ear, and she turned as well, her smile twitching with something unkind. They didn't wave. They didn't speak. But they began walking toward her, slowly, like cats spotting an old toy they thought they had broken and left behind. Each step brought with it memories Evelyn had buried under years of quiet resilience. Phone calls that ended in silence, promises that melted like butter on hot concrete, tears cried into a pillow until dawn broke like a reluctant apology. When they reached her table, the silence grew heavy, almost theatrical. Evelyn looked up, her face unreadable, her heart thudding against her ribs like a child knocking to be let out. Jordan leaned slightly, resting a hand on the chair beside her, his voice smooth with that same familiar blend of charm and contempt. "Evelyn? Wow. Didn't expect to see you here." His tone was friendly, but laced with that patronizing curiosity people used when they didn't really want answers. "Hope you're not lost. This isn't the Garkey Community Library, you know." Tasha giggled, a sound too sugary to be genuine. "Maybe she came to take inventory of the books on the program list," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Jordan smiled wider, clearly pleased with their performance. Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. Inside, her emotions tumbled like market goods falling off a rickety cart, but outside, her face remained still, carved from poise and quiet dignity. She didn't reply immediately. She didn't need to. Let them laugh. Let them assume. Even silence, when properly worn, can slap harder than words. Still, the sting was there, real, hot, unavoidable. All the hurt she had spent years boxing up was now clawing at its prison. But she would not give them the show they wanted. She folded her hands neatly, gave a faint smile, and returned her eyes to the program booklet. Around them, people glanced briefly before returning to their small talk. No one interfered. No one interrupted. Evelyn was back in a nightmare that wore a ball gown, and she had no intention of waking up screaming. She could feel their eyes still on her, long after they had walked away, like stains left behind by oily fingerprints on a glass pane. The sting of their words hadn't left either, though she wore her silence like a seasoned masquerade, draped in dignity, painted in restraint. Evelyn focused on her breathing, steady and measured, as if inhaling confidence and exhaling the ghost of humiliation. She adjusted her necklace slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, but not enough for the world to notice. She had learned over time how to bleed in silence. Pain had taught her well, and she was not about to forget those lessons now. But inside, the storm had already started. Her mind swirled with memories of Enugu, the laughter that used to flow freely between her and Jordan like palm wine in the village square. She remembered the tiny one-room apartment they once shared during NYSC, where a cracked mirror hung above the sink and their mattress sagged in the middle from too many nights curled up together, planning the future. Those were the years when everything felt possible, when love made them believe they could ride Okadas through life's storms and still end up in a mansion someday. Jordan used to call her his pillar, his peace, his Proverbs 31 woman. But time had a way of revealing the truth in people, peeling them like onions until all that remained was the pungent core. He hadn't outgrown her because she lacked ambition. He simply got tired of building when he found shortcuts to ready-made towers. Tasha, with her designer perfume and loud laughter, was one such shortcut. That wasn't bitterness speaking. That was experience. Some things don't need to be flavored to be true. Across the room, laughter erupted from a table close to the front, laughter that sounded like power shaking hands with influence. It was the table reserved for the high and mighty, the untouchables, the ones who wore Rolexes like rubber bands and flew across continents as casually as people crossed Third Mainland Bridge. Evelyn watched from afar, unnoticed again, but not unfamiliar with the feeling. She had always found herself orbiting circles like these, close enough to hear the music, but never close enough to dance. Her father had been a schoolteacher in Jos, her mother a seamstress. Her entire childhood had been stitched together with modest meals, borrowed textbooks, and hand-me-down dreams. But she had never felt poor. Not truly. They were not people of abundance, but they were people of contentment. What changed her life wasn't money, it was books. Words became her wings when circumstance clipped her feet. She had read her way through pain, through heartbreak, through betrayal. That was why she chose to work in a library, despite the paltry salary and the slow death of printed pages in a digital world. It wasn't just a job. It was her altar. She had once seen a child in Mararava cry tears of joy, just because she found a picture book with a princess who looked like her. That was the day Evelyn stopped asking the world for recognition. But tonight, as she sat in her corner in this temple of vanity, something inside her whispered, enough of hiding. Maybe it was the way Jordan's words had sliced through her calm like a razor. Maybe it was the way Tasha looked at her as though her presence was an inconvenience. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the fact that life had finally offered her a stage. And for once, she was going to stand in the light. As her eyes wandered again, trying to find a familiar face or a corner of comfort, the ballroom doors opened once more. This time there was no fanfare, no dramatic music, no announcement. Yet the room shifted immediately, as though gravity had rearranged itself. Conversations paused. Wine glasses froze midway to lips. Evelyn turned slowly, and her eyes landed on a man who walked with the authority of someone who had nothing to prove. Solomon Adegbite, the host of the night, the oil magnate whose wealth stretched from Lagos to London, whose name opened doors faster than master keys. He was tall, dark-skinned, and dressed in a charcoal gray suit that whispered class without shouting for attention. His presence was not loud, but it commanded silence. And as he moved through the crowd, shaking hands with quiet familiarity, people moved aside for him like ocean waves parting for a ship. Evelyn watched him without emotion. She had read about him countless times, his philanthropy, his business conquests, his mysterious air. But what she did not expect was for his eyes to find hers. Not in passing. Not by mistake. They lingered. And then, with deliberate steps, he began to walk toward her. For a brief moment, she thought maybe someone stood behind her. She even turned, but the only thing there was a vase of white lilies. When she turned back, he was standing directly in front of her table. The noise in the hall had dropped to a hush so dense it almost rang in her ears. Evelyn blinked, unsure if this was real. His voice, when it came, was deep, measured, and startlingly gentle. "Why are you sitting here alone?" he asked, his tone neither casual nor performative. It carried weight, history, power. And then, extending his hand as if offering her both shelter and storm, he added, "Come, join me at the high table." Her world stood still in that moment. She didn't rise immediately. Her instincts, trained over years of watching her own light get dismissed, hesitated. Her feet itched with fear, that kind that comes not from danger, but from disbelief that joy could ever knock on your door unannounced. She looked around, uncertain if this was a prank, a dare, a joke played on the girl who had learned to make peace with invisibility. But there was no mockery in his eyes. Just quiet conviction, like a man who knew exactly who he was speaking to. Slowly, Evelyn rose, her heartbeat drumming like talking drums in a village square. She placed her clutch bag under her arm and reached out, letting her fingers brush his with cautious grace. The contact was brief, but electric. Together, they walked, and the crowd parted like curtains in a theater, allowing them passage. Evelyn could feel the weight of eyes pressing into her skin, some curious, some envious, others bewildered. But she kept walking, her back straight, her steps measured. Jordan and Tasha were in her peripheral vision now. Their expressions had shifted. Jordan's smile had vanished, replaced with something uncertain. Tasha's mouth was slightly open, her eyes narrowed in disbelief. Evelyn didn't look at them. Not once. She kept her eyes on the table ahead, the one draped in velvet, lit with golden candlelight, surrounded by the titans of industry and power brokers of society. The high table. And as Solomon pulled out a chair for her, and the guests around shifted to make room, Evelyn sat not as a guest of pity, not as a woman dragged from the margins, but as someone who had simply been delayed, not denied, by destiny. The chair beneath her felt softer than anything she had sat on in years, but it was the weight of the silence around her that made her most aware she was no longer invisible. Conversation picked up slowly at the table, like a river learning how to flow again after hitting a stone. She kept her gaze steady, though inside her thoughts tumbled like clothes in a washing machine. The man beside her, Solomon Adegbite, had not said another word since she sat down. He simply returned to sipping his drink and occasionally nodding politely at those who greeted him. To everyone else, he appeared unfazed, as if inviting a stranger to the most exclusive seat in the room was an everyday gesture. But to Evelyn, the moment was still blooming in her chest like a late-bursting firework. She could feel every heartbeat in her neck, the way her fingers trembled slightly each time she reached for her glass of water. She wasn't sure where to place her hands, how to angle her elbows, what to do with her breath. She kept reminding herself not to fidget, not to reach for her phone, not to disappear into herself. She had spent years surviving by becoming small, by folding herself into corners and shadows where no one could poke at her wounds. But this was different. This was not a library backroom, not her quiet apartment in Maitama. This was the table where Lagos whispered its real secrets. The air smelled of power, cologne mixed with expensive decisions. Conversations danced around IPOs, real estate in Banana Island, offshore accounts in Dubai, charity galas in Monaco. She didn't contribute, but she listened, and listening had always been her superpower. Across the hall, Jordan's face was a canvas painted with disbelief. His wineglass sat untouched now, forgotten in the grip of a hand that no longer knew how to move without command. Tasha kept asking him questions in hushed tones, her eyes darting back and forth between Evelyn and Solomon. She looked like someone watching a magic trick she couldn't figure out, frustrated by the absence of visible wires. Jordan's confidence, once so loud it could be heard before he even entered a room, now shrank like fabric soaked in hot water. He had once told Evelyn she was good for now, when she had asked why he kept postponing their wedding. She hadn't understood what that meant until she saw him 6 months later, arm in arm with a woman he had known for barely 3 weeks. He'd moved on with the efficiency of a businessman closing a deal, cold, swift, unapologetic. Tonight, the balance had shifted. She wasn't looking to wound him, but there was a deep, ancient satisfaction in seeing his ego stagger without her ever needing to lift a finger. At the high table, Evelyn remained calm, her face still. Her silence was no longer out of caution. It had become her language. Every now and then, someone at the table would address her. A senator asked if she was in tech. A CEO assumed she must be running a startup. A minister inquired if she had anything to do with the UN delegation. Solomon, seated beside her, said nothing to correct them. He only smiled quietly, as if enjoying the mystery. When Evelyn finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "I'm a librarian," she said, pausing to let the words sink. "I run a reading program for children in Sabo." There was a pause, not awkward, but curious. Then, to her surprise, the senator leaned forward, interested. "That's rare. And important. You must be doing something right to be sitting here." Evelyn smiled, not wide, but enough to carry years of restrained pride. As the night unfolded, stories began to unravel like cloth from an untied bale. Evelyn sat quietly as the people around her recounted global travels, investments in gold, rumors of political reshuffling. She didn't pretend to know their world, but she held her own with grace. She had walked different paths, dustier, less traveled, but just as meaningful. And as the meal was served, she noticed how Solomon, though powerful, ate like someone who'd been hungry before. He didn't speak much, but he listened more than most people of his status. At one point, when a toast was proposed in honor of the guests, Solomon took the microphone, his voice even and calm. "We often speak of success as if it's always loud," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "But some of the most important people in this country are those who serve in silence. Those whose impact does not come in magazine spreads, but in the way they change lives, one person at a time." He didn't mention Evelyn's name. He didn't need to. She felt it, everyone did. A few heads turned toward her, subtle but certain. Evelyn took a slow sip of water and kept her face composed. She wasn't used to praise. Her victories had always been quiet, celebrated only in small inner circles, or sometimes not at all. She wasn't even sure she liked the attention, but she knew she had earned her seat tonight. Not by manipulation, not by association, but by being who she had always been, even when the world failed to notice. And now that it had, she would not flinch beneath the gaze. Later in the evening, Evelyn found herself on the open balcony, away from the warmth of chandeliers and the velvet hum of expensive conversations. The Lagos skyline stretched out before her, blinking in bright patterns, chaotic, beautiful, relentless. The night breeze played with the edges of her gown, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself a breath that didn't carry the weight of being watched. She rested her palms on the railing, eyes scanning the city that had once belonged to people like Jordan and Tasha, but now somehow didn't feel entirely foreign. Behind her, the music played softly, a saxophone floating through the hall like a secret. She heard footsteps but didn't turn immediately. When she did, Solomon stood at a respectful distance. "You held yourself well in there," he said, his voice sincere, stripped of the grandeur he wore like a second skin. Evelyn nodded, unsure what to say. Compliments often made her uncomfortable. He stepped closer, but not too near. "My late wife loved stories," he continued. "She used to talk about a girl who volunteered every Saturday in Sabo. Said she carried books like a priestess carries scriptures. Said she gave those kids something the world had denied them, possibility." Evelyn's lips parted slightly, her heart squeezing at the unexpected memory of dusty floors, broken benches, children who smiled with missing teeth and hopeful eyes. She hadn't known anyone was watching back then. She hadn't needed to. "That girl was you," Solomon said simply. "And I never forgot it." For a long moment, they both stood in silence, the city alive around them. Evelyn felt something lift from her chest, not validation but release. She hadn't come here to be rewarded. But tonight, her quiet seeds had bloomed in a garden she didn't even know existed. The soft murmur of night followed her back into the hall, but something had shifted. It wasn't the room. The chandeliers still glistened like caught raindrops, the waiters still glided past like shadows in uniform, and the air still hummed with invisible power. What had changed was Evelyn. Her silence had gained weight, not the kind that sinks a person, but the kind that grounds them, like the way a tree's roots deepen after every storm. The glances now felt different. They weren't mocking or dismissive. They were curious, speculative, and for some, nervous. People were beginning to notice her, not because she had shouted, but because Solomon Adegbite had chosen to. And that single gesture had made them reconsider everything they thought they knew about her. She wasn't a plus one. She wasn't a mistake on the guest list. She was someone. And in a world like this, being someone didn't always mean having money or followers. Sometimes it meant that a man like Solomon, who could sit with presidents and still dine in silence, recognized you without being told to. As Evelyn took her seat again, she saw the way a young woman at the table leaned forward to ask for her name. It was the kind of introduction wrapped not in politeness, but in intent. She answered quietly, her voice still carrying that grace which had shielded her through years of being underestimated. From across the room, Jordan watched again. This time he didn't hide it. His eyes followed every movement, every tilt of her head, every slight smile, every time someone leaned in to speak to her. It was the look of a man watching a door close behind him with finality. Tasha leaned back in her chair, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wineglass. Her patience was beginning to peel, exposing the restlessness beneath her carefully curated poise. She had entered the evening with the assumption that she was the focal point of the room, or at least of Jordan's world. But something had changed. Jordan had barely spoken in the last 10 minutes, his attention fixed on Evelyn in a way that was unfamiliar to Tasha. Not the nostalgic affection of a man reminiscing over a lost lover, but the awe of someone who had misjudged the value of what he once held. The realization stung her more than she expected. Her hand, adorned with a sparkling gold bracelet, trembled slightly as she set her glass down. She had fought to be here. She had dressed for this night like it was war. Every lash, every stone on her dress, every step she took was calculated to maintain her position. But no amount of shimmer could compete with quiet depth. Evelyn's presence, simple and unassuming, had begun to pull light toward itself in the way that truth often does, slowly, then all at once. Tasha glanced at Jordan, expecting some dismissive comment, something that would reaffirm her place, but he said nothing. His expression was unreadable, like a man watching a book he once owned become a bestseller in someone else's hands. She felt something slip, a hold, a grip, a thread she thought she had tied tight. It was then she realized something else. Evelyn hadn't done anything to win back Jordan's attention. She had simply become someone it was impossible to look away from. Back at the high table, Evelyn spoke little, yet the conversations that swirled around her often returned to her presence. She had become a question mark in a room that thought it already had all the answers. The most powerful people in Lagos weren't used to being surprised. They built their lives on predictability, who belonged, who didn't, who could be used, who should be avoided. Evelyn disrupted that structure simply by existing in a space they hadn't prepared for her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years walking on eggshells around people like this, afraid of missteps, of mispronounced names, of being reminded she didn't belong. Now she sat among them, not with borrowed confidence, but with a quiet claim on her space. It wasn't Solomon's approval that gave her that. It was the years behind her, late nights in the library when she could have given up, children with runny noses and bare feet calling her Auntie Book, the gratitude in their mother's eyes. Those moments, untelevised and uncelebrated, had built her from the inside out. Solomon knew. That's why he had walked across the room. Not to save her, not to rescue a woman being mocked, but to recognize someone who had always deserved to be seen. He didn't talk much after that, but his presence beside her spoke volumes. When he did lean in again, he only said, "You're doing well." And somehow, those 3 words meant more than a standing ovation. As dessert was served and the crowd began to thin out, Evelyn excused herself from the table. She needed air, not because she was overwhelmed, but because her heart was expanding with a fullness she hadn't felt in years. On her way out of the hall, she passed Jordan again. This time, he didn't look away. He stood slowly, as if pulled by something heavier than intention, and stepped into her path. For a heartbeat, neither of them said anything. The air between them felt like pages of an unfinished letter, one she had stopped reading long ago. "Evelyn," he said, his voice lower than she remembered, almost unsure. I didn't know you would be here." She tilted her head, not unkind, but steady. "I wasn't invited to impress you," she replied. The words weren't sharp. They were clean, honest, weightless. He took a breath, one of those sighs people let out when they realize they are too late. "You look different," he added. She smiled then, a smile that didn't ask for permission. "That's because you're finally seeing clearly." Behind him, Tasha stood frozen, her hand half raised, unsure whether to call him back or let him go. Evelyn didn't wait for either of them to act. She stepped aside and walked past, her heels clicking softly like punctuation marks in a chapter that had just closed. She didn't walk faster. She didn't look back. Not once. The drive back to the hotel was quieter than she expected, not in the absence of sound, but in the kind of silence that followed revelation. Lagos, though alive with its usual midnight breath, honking danfos, the far-off rhythm of a street drummer, vendors still calling out to late-night buyers, seemed somehow muted through the car window. Evelyn sat with her back straight, her hands resting gently on her lap, no longer clenching her clutch bag like a lifeline. The events of the evening didn't rush through her mind like a reel, but floated in and out like pieces of a story finally being stitched together. There had been no dramatic declarations, no grand endings, and yet, something deep within her had shifted. She had walked into that ballroom as someone forgotten, overlooked, even ridiculed. She walked out as someone seen. Not because she had performed or begged for acknowledgement, but because the truth of who she was had simply stood still long enough to be undeniable. The memory of Jordan's face stayed with her, not because she wanted him back, but because it reminded her of how far she had come without him. His disappointment, his discomfort, none of it touched her anymore. She had let go long before she ever knew she would have to. Some closures don't come from conversations or apologies. They come from outgrowing the version of yourself that once begged for them. And in that moment, as the city blurred past her window, Evelyn finally felt the quiet joy of a chapter closing properly, not slammed shut by betrayal, but turned slowly by her own hand. At the hotel, she removed her shoes with care, as though freeing herself from a costume. Her feet ached, not just from the heels but from the weight of the night. She sat on the edge of the bed, her gown still perfect, her makeup slightly faded but her face soft with the calm of a woman who had nothing left to chase. The room was dim, lit only by the warm glow of a lamp near the curtain, and in that stillness she allowed herself to breathe, deeply, fully, without the fear of being seen or judged. She walked barefoot to the window and parted the curtains just enough to look out at the city. The sea was there, dark and endless, and above it, a sky sprinkled with stars that Lagos rarely revealed. The skyline shimmered in the distance, full of dreams and distractions, but for once, Evelyn didn't feel like she was on the outside of anything. She didn't need more nights like the one she had just experienced. It wasn't the luxury or the spotlight that touched her. It was the recognition of her quiet labor, her invisible goodness, finally mirrored back at her in the gaze of someone who didn't need her to prove her worth. That was what Solomon Adegbite had given her, not status, not a place at the high table, but a mirror held up gently to show her she had never been lacking. As she poured a glass of water and sipped slowly, she realized it wasn't the gala that would stay with her. It was the moment she stood and took his hand without asking why. That was the moment everything changed, not because of who he was, but because of who she had allowed herself to be. The following morning brought with it a kind of softness she hadn't felt in years. There was no rush, no anxiety in her chest, no ghost of inadequacy trailing her. She took her time bathing, running her fingers gently through her hair, now damp and smelling faintly of honeyed shampoo. She dressed in a plain blouse and a long skirt, no makeup, no perfume, no jewelry. Yet she felt more radiant than she had the night before. It was a quiet kind of beauty, not designed to impress but simply to reflect peace. Her flight back to Abuja was in the afternoon, and she spent the hours before it walking slowly through the hotel garden, greeting the staff, sitting by a small water fountain, listening to birds. The air carried the faint scent of hibiscus and damp soil, and she allowed herself to exist in it without needing to prepare for anything else. A staff member brought her a letter, sealed and bearing no sender's name. She opened it under the shade of a palm tree, her fingers steady. Inside was a short note. Thank you for reminding me that the most powerful people are not always the loudest ones. S.A. There was no number, no address, no invitation, just a line of truth that didn't ask for response. Evelyn folded it slowly and tucked it into her bag, next to the book she'd carried for years, a battered collection of poems by Nigerian women writers. She smiled, not for what had been said, but for what had been left unsaid. Sometimes, the most genuine connections are the ones that don't need to be defined. They're just felt, known, honored. By the time she arrived back in Maitama, the sky was already preparing for dusk. The air was cooler, filled with the scent of rain teasing the horizon. She walked through the familiar corridor of her apartment building, greeting Mama Nkechi, who sold groundnuts downstairs, and the young boy who always played with a deflated football near the gate. Nothing had changed here. The walls still had peeling paint, the air still carried the faint hum of a generator, and the neighbor's radio still played high-life music as if stuck in the same hour forever. But Evelyn had changed. As she opened her door and stepped into her tiny room, she didn't see what was missing anymore. She saw what had endured. The bookshelf by the wall, the stack of papers filled with children's stories she had been working on, the tiny potted plant by her window that refused to die no matter how often she forgot to water it. All of it reminded her that her life was not waiting to begin. It had already begun. And though it didn't have chandeliers or red carpets, it had purpose. That evening, she went back to the library. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to be among the books again. As she entered, the children looked up, their faces lighting up like someone had switched the generator on. "Auntie Evelyn," they called, rushing toward her with the kind of welcome that could melt granite. She smiled, kneeling to embrace them, her heart fuller than it had ever been. She may not have stayed at the high table, but she didn't need to. She had always had a table of her own. And now she saw it clearly. My dear listener, if life has ever pushed you into the shadows, let this story remind you. You do not have to shine loudly to be seen deeply. You may not have the loudest voice, the fanciest clothes, or the biggest crowd cheering you on. But if your heart is pure, your work is honest, and your intentions are rooted in kindness, the right people will find you, and the right doors will open. Never shrink yourself to fit into places that were never built for your light. Walk in grace, and let your silence speak louder than noise. Heavenly Father, the lifter of heads and the mender of hearts, thank you for reminding us that no one you have created is ever too small to be noticed. We pray today for every listener who has been overlooked, mocked, or left behind. May you turn their silence into strength, and their waiting into a wonder. Let those who have walked through shame rise in honor. Where they've been laughed at, may they become a source of inspiration. Let the tables turn in their favor, not by force, not by pride, but by your divine timing. May their dignity remain intact, their peace unshaken, and their purpose unstoppable. Elevate them to places they never applied for, and seat them where only favor can reach. In the presence of those who doubted them, let their light shine without apology. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.